Welcome all you wiretappers out there. Back here in the studio of Gangland Wire, I've got Anthony or Tony DeStefano on the line and on the Zoom call. He's got a new book out, The Deadly Don. It's a story about Vito Genovese, one of the more interesting mafia bosses that came out of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. He was a long-serving boss. You can see the cover of the book. Okay, let me take that down. Welcome, Tony. I'm really glad to have you on again.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So let's kind of go back over, remind people of some of your other books. You're a pretty prolific author, Tony. Gotti's Boys, talking about all the guys that John Gotti surrounded himself with. As it said, he did not do everything he did alone. Nobody does anything that they do alone. He surrounded himself with a whole rogues gallery of contract killers, fixers, enforcers, and to build, his little crime empire, which really didn't last too long. You've got the Big Heist, a take on the Lufthansa Airlines heist, 1978. Gangland New York, the places and faces of mob history. Mob Killer, the bloody rampage of Charles Cornelia, Mafia Hitman, Mafia Madness and Murder. King of the Godfathers, the Joseph Big Joy Massino. Let me do that one again. Redo for my editor. King of the Godfather. You've got King of the Godfathers, the story of Joseph Big Joy Massino. I think you have another one too. Is it Vinny Gorgeous?
Yeah, I have Vinny Gorgeous, the ugly story of a New York mobster. And I think, I don't know if you mentioned the Frank Costello book, Top Hoodlum. So that's another one.
I did not. All right. So is that, have we covered them all, man? I tell you what, you're the epitome of the mob historian.
Well, it's been a lot of work, let me tell you, but some of it's been quite fun.
Oh, good. Well, let's talk about Vito Genovese. He was, and one of the things I think is most interesting is his place in those mob meetings. Started off with back in Sicily. I believe he attended a meeting with Lucky Luciano, and then the meeting in Cuba, and he was just a central figure in that international narcotics trafficking that the mob did over the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Well, Vito, he was, of course, was in the United States after he emigrated here in the early 20th century. He went back to Italy in the 1930s with a murder indictment breathing down his neck in Brooklyn. He returned to Italy and lived there, and he got tight with Mussolini's government, Mussolini's son-in-law, and they say Mussolini himself. And he was apparently doing meetings over there with people involved in the narcotics trade. The meetings he went to, from what we've been able to learn, I don't think he was involved in that 1950s meeting in Palermo, where a lot of the American gangsters and some of the local Sicilian mafiosi met to solidify procedure and in the heroin trade. But he was involved, this was Vito Genovese, in a meeting in 1947, late 46, early 1947 in Havana, Cuba, where Lucky Luciano came back to the Western Hemisphere after being exiled to Italy or deported, where everybody had a big meeting. There was a big meeting with Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, the Chicago crew, I believe Anastasia was involved, a whole slew of people, and they kicked around narcotics as well. And that was a meeting where Luciano supposedly demurred and didn't want to get involved, but everybody else was trying to figure out what to do about it. Some for it, some against it. Ultimately, Genovese was involved in a very big narcotics case here in 1958 in New York, which ultimately got him sent to prison. So he was involved in at least one major meeting, and obviously was doing other stuff here in New York with some other meetings as well that went on. So that's in a nutshell was his involvement.
Yeah, it
He was
seemed like,
involved. Let's put it that way.
yeah, it seemed like he was involved with the Appalachian Meeting. Actually, he had Albert Anastasia had been killed, and when he kind of like if I remember right, he was one of the people that really wanted that meeting to happen. He's trying to assert himself as more powerful as he moves on up.
That's true. I mean, the Appalachian Meeting in 1957 took place some weeks after Albert Anastasia was assassinated in the barber's chair in New York. Vito, at that point, was trying to position himself as the preeminent New York City gangster and push for the meeting. In fact, there was a little mini meeting before that, some weeks before that, out in New Jersey. And a group of people got together to sort of have a pre-summit summit in a way. There was some pushback from the Chicago mob. They didn't want to go to a place like Appalachia, upstate New York. Appalachian is a town, actually. And they said, look, we own Chicago. We know the police. Why do you want to go to a place like Appalachian where you don't know anybody? You're not sure of the police. It's a small town, no resources. Why go? Vito nonetheless pushed, and he had some support from some of the New York-based mobsters. And that's where the meeting was held. And of course, as you know, and probably many of your listeners and viewers know, that turned out to be a disaster when the state police sort of stumbled upon it, and the gangsters were, pictured trying to flee the meeting, some running through the woods, others trying to, run the roadblocks of the police. So it was kind of a disaster for the mob because they got so much attention. They got so many problems. Some of them got indicted, although Vito didn't. Ultimately, those cases were thrown out, but it caused a lot of trouble and I think a lot of resentment towards Vito Genovese for pushing for that meeting in Appalachian.
Yeah, really, actually, it affected us here in Kansas City. Our new boss, who was really under the radar at that time, was on his way there with an old boss from the 20s and 30s, guy named Tano Lococo, and the new boss, Nick Zavella, was a young guy, and he had really just taken over, but he was way under the radar, which he always liked to stay, and they got caught up in a railroad station on their way north to this meeting. So with that, let everybody in Kansas City know his importance on a national level. So that, and that's, that's the deal. If they'd like to keep their names down low, the good ones like Chicago and Kansas City, and the better ones in New York, they like to keep that low profile and so law enforcement won't focus on them so much.
Well, that didn't happen.
No, not under that meeting, especially. That was huge headlines, huge. And then they had a grand jury afterwards that put all everybody's names even more in the headlines. So I'm curious about something. Lucky Luciano told a story in his book, was it The Last Testament of Lucky Luciano, about his confrontation with Vito Genovese at that Cuba meeting. Supposedly, the way I read it was that Genovese went to him and said, I've got information that the Cuban government is being pressured by the U.S. government because they know you're here and they want you to go back to Italy, because Luciano was trying to move closer to the United States. And Luciano thought that Genovese had been the one who told the government about him being in Cuba and beat him up. What do you think about that story?
Well, I read those same passages in Luciano's Last Testament. He said that Genovese told him just before the summit in Havana that, look, why don't you step down? I'll take over. It'd be better for everybody. And Luciano, of course, was not going to have anything of it. And he read Genovese the Riot Act, and it was clear that he did not like Genovese, thought him a scheming kind of guy. Ultimately, Luciano also relates a story, I don't know if you remember this, in the book, in which he said he and Genovese got into basically a fist fight in Luciano's hotel room in Havana. And, the image of these two middle-aged gangsters sort of rolling around and having a fight is, in one sense, comical. In another sense, I'm not sure I necessarily believe it because some of that stuff we just can't verify.
Yeah.
Luciano related certain injuries that Genovese sustained in that fight. They didn't square up what we later know about Genovese's medical records, which I was able to read from his prison days. So did it happen? I don't know, but it would have been a hell of a fight, I'm sure. Genovese got the worst of it, according to Luciano, of course.
Yeah.
Right?
Of course, the guy writing the book's going to be the winner. That's
Of
for
course.
sure. Yeah, I'm with you, Tony. Like, I just can't imagine these two little old middle-aged men rolling around, scrapping on the floor, and one really beats the other one up. And unless one of them has a couple of guys hold the other one while he works him over, I don't know.
Yeah.
But, which would be more likely the fact if it really happened like Luciano alleges that it happened. So Genovese makes a move on Frank Costello, which I think is interesting and one of the more interesting stories out of that 1950s New York mobster milieu, shall we say. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, after Luciano was deported to Italy in about 1946, the control of the was Luciano's crime family by default and by arrangement really went to Costello. He was the more preeminent guy of the clique. He had the political connections. He had the savvy. He had legitimate businesses. And was a more favored caretaker for Luciano when Luciano was deported. Genovese resented that and always wanted to be the more powerful because he sensed that after he went through his own legal troubles that he didn't really get his share of the illegal business and really resented that. So ultimately, in 1957, again, that was another watershed year, Genovese teamed with Vinny the Chin, and they ambushed Costello as he went into his apartment building on Central Park West one evening. And Costello was shot. He was winged in the head and, of course, survived. But, he got the message, and he decided he was going to retire and turn over essential control of the family to Genovese, which is where it remained, at least for a little while. The killer, the suspect, Vinny the Chin, went on the lam for a couple of weeks, but ultimately he was caught and brought to trial and acquitted, basically after Costello said, I can't. I don't know who shot me. And, it was one of those classic mob stories where Costello turned around when he heard the words, "This is for you, Frank." The gun went off and there was one wound to the head, a slight wound. And although he wasn't killed, Costello got the message and figured, why don't I just retire and grow orchids out in Long Island?
Really, to compare or contrast those two mob bosses is like the yin and the yang, if you will, of mob bosses, the way they conducted business. Costello was known as the great negotiator, and I've just made that up, but the prime minister, he formed relationships to make money all over the United States, even here in Kansas City and down in Louisiana to make money off of gambling on a nationwide basis. While Genovese was this feared, narcotics dealer who, his main claim to fame was he was so violent and murderous that people scared him. Whereas Costello, you can make a deal and make some money with Costello. Those two guys were just the polar opposite ends of the mob spectrum, wouldn't you say?
Well, Genovese in his younger days, particularly, was accused of carrying out homicides. Later, in the 30s, in the 40s, other people were doing his bidding, and he got the reputation for being a rough character. He wasn't physically rough with people as he matured, but he had people to do his bidding, particularly for that clique from the West Side with Tony Bender and Strollo, Anthony Strollo, and some others. Genovese did have legitimate businesses. So in that sense, he was similar to Costello, but they weren't very successful businesses. And he really didn't have his finger into some of the major quasi-legitimate rackets like the slot machines and gambling operations, which Costello had a significant piece of. Costello, of course, had the political connections that Genovese didn't have. And that was an important power base back in the 30s and 40s in New York and into the 50s, too. Genovese didn't have that. So he had to rely more on muscle and hardcore illegal activity than, say, Costello later in life.
Interesting. So I guess that the last case, the narcotics case that put him in jail and ended up, which is kind of an unintended consequences, ended up with Joe Bellocci becoming famous as the first real well-known mob informant that outlined it for the public and the government as well, but mainly for the public, because the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was really watching these guys and documenting the mafia. The FBI wasn't back then, but the FBN or the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was. So what was that narcotics case that Genovese fell on?
Well, the narcotics case was, you're right, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics had it in for somebody like Genovese, and they had him on their radar. There was a lot of activity on the federal side, tracing narcotics from a variety of sources, mainly Europe, but some from Asia. Genovese, the evidence showed at his subsequent trial that he really wasn't involved in the dealing, the transactions, the smuggling. This was stuff that was coming out of places like Cuba and Puerto Rico, because Cuba at that point was still, while the narcotics were being trafficked, still somewhat open because Castro hadn't taken power yet, and it was considered a source point. Later, of course, they had to switch their operations to Puerto Rico because Cuba became a lost venue after Castro took power and the revolution was underway, and there really wasn't much they could do. So the smuggling crew, Genovese's comrades, as it were, used Puerto Rico, and there was a lot of trafficking that was going on, a lot of shipments. Places like Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Miami were involved in the transshipping operations. And ultimately what happened was that the feds, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, turned an informant, this guy Cantaloupes, and he was a Puerto Rican immigrant who came to the United States, lived in Chicago for a short while, and then came to New York, where he sort of knocked around doing this and that, got involved in drug dealing, and ultimately in heroin. And he was the one who, after he got in trouble, of course, flipped and was able to give the Federal Bureau of Narcotics the, I think, slender evidence that Genovese was ultimately indicted on. It was a very strange transaction. The only substantial evidence they had was a Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent sitting in a hotel, in a restaurant, German restaurant in New York City, and supposedly within earshot, as Genovese was introduced to Cantaloupes and saying, "Oh, he's all right," meaning kind of a ratification or giving him a stamp of approval for being a good guy for the dope ring. And that was enough when they put the case together to ensnare Genovese into the heroin operation. It was a fairly big case. They had a lot of people indicted off of it, the spin-off investigations. Carmine Galante and Dimo Papadio was a big garment district guy. John Ormento, another big New York gangster. And Vinny the Chin was also ensnared in the case. And they indicted everybody in 58. It wasn't long after, in fact, Genovese refused to testify to Congress that he got indicted. And he went to trial. And despite his protestations of innocence, he got convicted and got his long prison sentence, which was basically the death knell for him because he died in prison. That, in a nutshell, is what happened. Genovese would go to his death protesting his innocence, saying he was framed. And, of course, his appeals went to naught. And that's what happened to him. He had a very short career as boss on the street, because don't forget, 57, he really takes over the family. Then in 58, he gets charged. And then, he really gets pulled into prison shortly after that. So he was like John Gotti in some sense. He didn't have much time on the street as the unfettered boss.
Interesting. First comment I have, or maybe just a couple more details, is that move from Cuba to Puerto Rico. I didn't really realize that before. I think that's not real well known that they moved out.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there was a lot of smuggling going on via Cuba for the heroin early in this conspiracy. Of course, they had to search for an alternate market, transshipping point, when Castro started making trouble because it became unstable in Cuba.
Yeah.
And there was, they had to switch, and they switched to islands just off Cuba, Puerto Rico, and as well as Puerto Rico, the mainland itself. And that's what happened. And the interesting thing in Genovese's case, to buttress his argument, so to speak, that he was framed, was that there was a federal agent who showed up at his house one day in New Jersey and said he wanted to speak to him. Of course, Genovese was very cautious and suspicious about why this guy's showing up. And the guy told him, well, you're being framed, they're trying to make a case against you for publicity purposes, and gave him, some information, which they had to take to federal court because this guy was a federal agent and making these allegations. And there was a full-blown inquiry about it. This guy, Beggendorf was his name, a federal agent. And they did an investigation. And it's not clear who was telling the truth on this. Beggendorf did go to Genovese's house, but he denied subsequently saying some of the things that Genovese said he said. And then so that didn't go anywhere, although it stoked Genovese's suspicion that he was being set up. Later, after Genovese got convicted, Cantaloupes tried to recant his testimony. And it's in the book, it's all described in the book in detail. And it turns out one of the other drug defendants set this up and I guess coerced Cantaloupes to give a half-hearted recantation of his testimony, and then later had to recant the recantation. So it all sort of collapsed. And of course, Genovese's appeals went no place at that point. And he spent his remaining days in prison, where he died.
Wow. So I guess one last thing here, and then I have a couple questions, or a question at least about your research process on these mob guys. This Bellocci thing. Now, he was in Atlanta with Joe Bellocci, Bellocci was a soldier in the Genovese family, or in that family, and Bellocci thought that he was being set up to be murdered for some reason.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, Bellocci was in Atlanta with Genovese. They apparently shared a cell for a while. Bellocci had his own drug cases that got him sent to prison. And he sensed, Bellocci did, that he was being set up to be killed in prison by one of the, I think it was Joseph Di Palermo, who was another drug defendant with Genovese. And it was a case of mistaken identity. Bellocci killed a guy in the prison yard who turned out to be the wrong guy. He wasn't connected to any plot to murder him. Of course, that got Bellocci in more trouble. And the only way out for him, you do a homicide in prison, you're going to, whatever your earlier troubles were, this is really trouble. He decided to, turn into the big cooperating witness against the mafia, in particular Genovese, because Genovese was his boss in the Genovese crime family. So it was then that Bellocci saw the light and decided to become what was, for the time, the major government witness against the mafia. And that the hearings that spawned in the Congress, the testimony, and it was, it was quite a show. And he ensnared Genovese and other allegations, but didn't mean anything because Genovese was already in jail. And Genovese denied basically knowing him and said that, Bellocci's making up stories. And history will be the judge of that.
Yeah, really, yeah. So yeah, that Genovese, he was involved in several watershed moments in mob history, and so it's he
was, and he was these moments really the direction for his these events was all sort of negative for him. He was impelled to. The Appalachian Meeting turned out to be a mob disaster and really caused a lot of resentment for him. And his high profile, as a result of being a preeminent New York mobster, put him on the radar of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And that put him into trouble. Ultimately, that was the straw that broke his back. And he got sent to prison after what was a short run as boss. And he really was star-crossed, as it were, as a boss. But look at it this way: the Genovese crime family today is still named after Vito Genovese, and that's his legacy.
Yeah.
No matter what happened to him, no matter how stillborn his career was as the top boss, this crime family is still known as the Genovese crime family. It's nobody else. It's not Luciano or anybody else.
I noticed that is so. I've always often wondered about that names of crime families and how that sticks. The Gambino family, and Gotti desperately wanted to be the Gotti family. I don't think that really stuck, but in the popular consciousness and I guess actually the press is the one who decides what the name of a family is over the long haul. Yeah,
it's Messino also wanted to change the name of the Bonanno crime family to the Messino crime family. That didn't go over well. That didn't happen. And Gotti, of course, you're probably right. He probably did want it to be known as the Gotti family. But these modern day guys, apart from Genovese, and Bonanno, and Lucchese, right? The old timers.
Yeah.
Those are the names that have stuck. And it's interesting to see how that legacy continues today.
I'll tell you what, if I was a mob boss today, I would not want it to be the Jenkins crime family. First of all,
right, exactly.
You get the heat,
right?
But I don't want the heat, man. And that's
what would happen. These guys know today. You're out front. You name it. Either you name a crime family after yourself, or you're the known big boss on the street. You're going to draw the heat of law enforcement. And you're going to draw so much attention, and there are going to be so many attempts to ensnare you in Rico cases, racketeering cases, that it's not worth it. Everybody today who's out working out on the street as a street boss is trying to keep low level, and doing it with various degrees of success. But you don't want that attention today. You don't need to have all the attention and all the resources of law enforcement coming down on your head, which is what will happen.
It's exactly. I'll tell you, I worked organized crime in Kansas City for 13, 14 years. And even the children of the Savella family, who were just small time guys. They never really became anything or really tried to become anything in the mob, but they had their own little drug things going on. I mean, you can't believe the resources that came down on them just because of their last name. I mean, that's thanks grandpa or thanks great uncle for that last name, because they didn't get away with anything, and gave, you know, pretty decent sentences to them too.
You know, that's what happens. You know, I mean, you get the attention, the cases get made against you, and you know, you don't need this. And there's so many informants out there, so many people waiting to be a cooperating witness. There was a joke. Somebody said that the best career path in Howard Beach, an area where Gotti worked out of in Queens, is to be a cooperating witness. You know, the mob doesn't have 401ks, longevity programs, you know, retirement programs. So the only way you have to do is to make it yourself by being a cooperator.
Really, and that myth about him taking care of your family when you go away is there's
Sure.
been many a guy have debunked that myth with their direct experiences. Michael DiLeonardo is one example, and there's several others. You know, they just don't do it. At least they didn't in his case, and several others. So
That's true.
one last thing, Tony. I really appreciate you coming on here, and this
My
guy
pleasure. Yeah,
interesting
I
thing.
like.
Tell me just a little bit about your research process. Now, you know, I know you can do Freedom of Information Act requests, and there's a lot of them already out there online, but they're so heavily redacted, you have to go beyond the Freedom of Information Act request from the FBI. What other sources do you use?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, when I first started this years ago, back in the 70s, you know, we didn't have databases. You didn't have a lot of trial history on some of these cases. So you had that new reservoir of transcripts, proceedings, results of litigation. What we had to do, we basically had to go through the old newspaper archives, a very laborious process. You know, the old reader's guide to periodical literature. You know, if you didn't know things, you had to start from scratch. Today, not only because I have the institutional memory of some of these criminal cases and some of the history, what you also have is a more extensive database collection where you can go back into the trials, you can go back into periodical articles and government records. And much easier now to do this. You can do it at the top, you know, sitting at your desk with your moving your fingers across the keyboard. Also, what you have, and this is a very good resource for anybody doing this kind of research, consider the National Archives because they're often the repository of many of the old trial transcripts and records, court records of these cases. I use extensively this particularly in the Big Heist, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese. I got the help of people at the National Archives in New York and in Washington, Silver Springs, Maryland. They were able to provide me with some treasure trove of materials. And also, you know, you got to not forget your state law enforcement and go back into those archives. So you have all of this vast amount of material that you can cull through. And also, with digital resources, you have the digitization of newspapers, old newspapers. And you can go back on some things like newspapers.com or whatever, ancestry.com or whatever. And you can go back as far as you want. And you can not only get the big papers for your area, but also some local databases have the local newspapers, which provide other information. I'm doing a project on prohibition for my newspaper Newsday, and I found a lot of interesting stuff on some of the local newspapers, which are now in digital format. You can just call those up, and they give you other leads, and it's great.
Yeah, that's it is. So here it is. So put your picture back up. Your book. There it is, folks. The Deadly Don, Vito Genovese, Mafia Boss. I'm gonna have to, Teresa, I'm gonna redo that one. There it is, folks. The Deadly Don, Vito Genovese, Mafia Boss by Anthony M. DeStefano. So, Tony, I really appreciate you coming on, and you've been really enlightening as far as I'm concerned on that research. finding those old court records through the National Archives, I've stumbled onto those here in the last couple of years, and it is a huge treasure trove. They've got to be so old. They've got to be like 25 years old, and they
Oh,
have
yeah,
to be,
yeah.
if they were of any noteworthy, they do a good job. If they think they could ever be of any interest to anybody, they'll save that file, they'll digitalize it and save it, and you can get it on CDs even. It's quite a resource.
Yeah, I went back to the 1920s on something very recent, so it proves your point.
Really, and newspapers.com, I got onto that. It's a great, those old writers, especially back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, they were much more colorful than they are today.
Oh, yeah. People ask me, I mean, do you give much credence to what was written in the papers back then? Well, if they cover court proceedings, generally I think there's a note of trustworthiness to that, what was said in court, what happened in court, when you get into the analytical stuff and the feature stories, then you got to take it with a grain of salt. But the writing was very colorful, and it sort of rounds out the picture.
Yeah, it does. It does. All right, Anthony DeStefano, I appreciate you coming on. Thanks a lot, Tony.
Thanks, Gary.
Bye.
Bye-bye.